conclusion of last week's presentation, I told you I would start today by asking you what about last week's process, information, or discussion is still floating around or you've been thinking about since last week. Why?
I get it. It's just I got to understand the materials. I understand, certain heat, certain temperatures, certain things happen. I understood all of it. It was like, oh, okay, I get it now. Now it's just like trying to understand the setup papers you gave us to try and figure out. But I'm getting it. I'm getting there.
Okay.
Well, I just, in doing the video for last week, I watched a lot of this stuff over and over again and just kept absorbing, that's all. I haven't had a chance to fill in the papers or anything because I have other things I had to do this week.
Was there any part of that that was particularly interesting? Or
oh, interesting. I don't know.
That really grabbed your attention, surprised you, or?
Nothing really surprised me, let's put it that way. I think I have a grasp of that. I just have to learn the chemicals.
All right. Linda, do you have recall of any part of last week's discussion?
Well, the main thing about, of course, last week's lecture was a lot of stuff that I already know from a different perspective.
Right.
And I think that I enjoyed very much putting it in this context, especially the thermal reactions, because that's something that I deal with a lot. I once taught a Geology 114 class, which is all about, there's a big, it's oceanography, and there's all this section of it that's all about the Earth's crust and the plate tectonics and the pillow basalt, and I even had to take a field trip out to Avila Beach and climb around and show them the pillow basalt and everything. But yeah, I think the thermal reactions were what really stuck with me a lot, and made a lot of sense to me. It kind of like was puzzle pieces that were fitting into place. And actually, for me, this is really novel to be in a class where I actually have a context to put new information instead of feeling like I'm taking this brand new piece and sort of hanging it here all by itself. So I like that a lot. I don't know that there was anything I felt that was surprising. Of course, the part you would be surprised about this, but that I completely don't know the periodic table at all. And and the other thing I think I love, well, there's all the stuff about thermal reactions, and then the stuff about that we were looking at the end was about the expansions and contractions, and how that worked with different types of materials. I think that was very interesting. So.
In reflecting on last week's material, a couple of things that I think are particularly significant. The differences in basic types of clay, primary and secondary clay, that will come up again and again as we go forward. Primary clay being the pure kaolinite mineral, or kaolin, or China clay as it's also referred to, which is very specifically tied to the fact that the Chinese figured out how to apply enough heat to kaolin to turn it into porcelain. Technologically, a very sophisticated shift in things that, at 800 AD. Another is the transformation of the material by applying heat. That the ceramic change, as it's called, where we take clay as this plastic when wet and somewhat brittle when dry, and apply enough heat, and suddenly it's a whole new material. Ceramic and aluminosilicate, incredibly durable, doesn't break down by all of the usual things that take organic materials and most metals apart over time. That's why the museums are full of pottery for the most part, because it's the most durable
But they
material.
don't have the old iron tools that they had developed in the early, because they rusted and could deteriorate.
Right, right. Much of that stuff we've lost, the technology. It was a very interesting book about 10,000 inventions in China, technologically speaking, over something like 6,000 years. But one of the fascinating things about Chinese culture was that when one dynasty supplanted another, they tended not to build on the previous culture's technology, but to exclude it.
That would make sense, though.
You know, and it was all about creating a sense of supremacy in the new dynasty. So they had clocks and libraries and printing presses and all sorts of stuff, and they would burn and destroy
And start over.
yeah, that's a fascinating part. We'll touch more on the side of the porcelain there. And then the final one that's most significant to us is that sequence of changes as we go up to higher temperature, when we shift from earthenware and its porous nature at maturity to the vitrification that takes place when we get to a high enough temperature and the clay body begins to melt within itself, and all those little spaces between the clay particles slightly collapse but also fill with feldspathoids and melted ingredients to become glass-like.
I did make a list of questions, and of course I left it home.
Yeah, naturally. Yeah. That's
But,
usually my.
Now that I think of it, what I noticed in reading was they kept mentioning these minerals and different things being used in the clay body and in glaze, but they also talked about clay itself being in the glaze. And then when you showed us the clay out of the riverbed and you use it as a glaze, you don't throw it into.
Although we could.
You could, but you never built it into a clay
Right.
body, right?
Right.
You used it just strictly as a glaze, which that is interesting to me, that you're putting clay on clay, and
Well, that's basically what underglazes are, aren't they? Is that they're basically a.
If you
clay.
fire them to a high enough temperature, they will melt and become glass-like. But we never put them on thick enough to have the substance of a glaze coating.
Yeah.
So,
Marty did some samples last
right,
semester.
she put underglazes all the way to high temperature.
Yeah.
Some of them, particularly the Amico brand velvet underglazes, are vibrant colors, even at cone 10 reduction.
yeah, I just got a whole bunch
Yeah.
more
Gotta
velvets.
talk to Marty.
Have you ever spent any time pondering how this all got started?
Yeah.
What were the terms by which people realized that they could bake clay and come up with this new object, this new product?
First, they had to discover the use of fire.
Yeah.
Then they had to come up with something to cook on the fire.
Fire came fairly early.
Yeah,
early on.
but they had to.
It strikes me as though it might have been like a happy accident. That's how
go.
beer came along. Was that somebody had a pot of grain and it fermented, and they discovered beer. But otherwise, no, I really don't know how that.
The most recent archaeological investigations dealing with pottery are starting to push the date back to 20,000 years before present in Western China.
Yeah.
Up until that, it was generally considered that the Jomon people in Japan at 11,000 years before present were some of the principal initiators. But now, that's pushing back half again or more pottery that was discovered in community sites very, very
Well,
old.
that makes sense because Japan is inhabited by peoples from other places that all came to these uninhabited islands and merged together to make the Japanese people. So I would think that they would have brought with them the knowledge that they developed years before in China.
It seems quite reasonable. I was reading this week about glacial period, Ice Age, coastal travelers that they're beginning to sort of say, yeah, the land bridge, but before the land bridge was a whole nother wave of immigration.
They just found a piece of smelt iron that is dated to 12,000 BC.
Found it where?
Europe. I'll print the article. I was like, what? Wait a minute.
12,000, yeah.
I mean, it's huge. It's really huge. And then there was a young kid, a boy, on the beach of the East Coast who found a 10,000-year-old projectile, pre-Clovis projectile, just walking on the beach. I'm like, I'd like to find one of those.
Going back to the question of how it all started, I showed you the photo of the Santa Maria riverbed, and I can imagine a situation where somebody builds a fire on that kind of underlayer, and the next day, big rainstorm, and everything washes away, and there's the fired piece.
That might be, that would be a real interesting thing.
I was thinking that they went and took the dirt and put out their fire, which I don't think they really did because they didn't have matches to start a new one. But that they could pour water on the fire. If we do that, you put the water on the hot, I don't know.
I think, unfortunately, I think a lot of information has been lost over the ages, and that we may never know the real truth. But I have a feeling that civilizations far back beyond what we can comprehend have been doing things.
That's actually what you're saying is really true, because not just with this, but just what Bob was alluding to is the fact that until cultures developed a way to permanently record what they knew. Every generation, it was everything that was passed on word of mouth, and so different catastrophes would happen and would wipe out all knowledge, and people would have, and there is no real way of going back and finding out. Well, I mean, there's quite a bit of evidence that mathematics existed, for the Greeks, but. That was where it first got recorded.
Do you want me to take copies for the...
I have them.
Okay, you want me just to give them to them? You want to give them to them? Or?
When they come back,
Okay.
I got an email from Kathleen Haberman. And she and Kathy Havelka are traveling together right now in South Dakota. But they emailed me to say that they were in Custer, South Dakota, which is in the Black Hills.
Right.
Black Hills are a very strange geographic and geologic feature where there's all kinds of minerals. But the key thing about Custer is that's the source of our potash feldspar that is used in 70–80% of all glass making. And so I've been there as well, but they're gathering chunks for me and bring back samples of such things. Today's discussion is about heat, sources of heat, and the reason that we use a fuel burning kiln for high fire as opposed to an oxidation-based electric kiln. Let me go get that 3-hole punch.
Oh, man.
You three represent an unusually savvy group, so it's not like we have to remind people that their life experiences actually count for something, and we can go through some of this very quickly. So electric kilns are relatively new innovation in the world of ceramics. General distribution of electricity throughout the United States is anywhere from 50 to 100 years. Before that, first we needed Edison spending 10,000, we're told, experiments to figure out how to create the incandescent light. What do you do with electricity if didn't run motors, I suppose, but the illumination of North America was probably a fundamental part of federal investment, rural electrification projects. Do you ever encounter any of those? Any of your family trips?
No, that wasn't what that was. No.
Okay. There were just lots of parts of the country where it made no economic sense to invest in the distribution system, and so the federal government stepped in and made sure that the companies that were happy to circulate electric energy in cities would also accept responsibility for getting electrical supply to everyone.
I mean, I studied that stuff, you know,
Right.
because I was a history major back in the long, long ago, but actually going out and looking at it, no, I was more into RFD instead of...
So, an electric kiln is like a toaster oven. And I don't know anybody who didn't grow up wondering what made the bread turn brown, except, you know, looking down in those slots and seeing those strips of wire glowing orange and the heat coming out of there. But the fascinating thing to me about electricity these days has to do with how we create the movement of electrons. And the simplest form of that I can think of is that we take a source of heat and we apply it to a large container which is full of water. And when the water is sufficiently hot and begins to go through the phase change from a liquid to a gas, there's a spectacular increase in pressure within the volume. Whoops. Color. Screw up. Where's the purple one? What'd I do? There's purple.
He needs more colors.
And that pressure that's created, we talked last week about it being a factor of 10,000 times the volume increase, so if we keep it trapped in there, it blows against a turbine blade which is attached to an axle, and attached to the axle are large strong magnets, and wrapped around the magnets are coils of copper wire, and the magnet and the field around the magnet causes electrons to move in the copper wire, which eventually ends up going across the country and lands at a substation just north of the racetrack up on the mesa, where the voltage is stepped down from 12,000 and 24,000 volts to some other more manageable voltage, and is distributed then by power lines that cross the river and eventually end up in a power pole right over here on the corner across the street from Bradley, where the wires then go underground, go to transformers that are on the other side of the student center and are distributed underground through various cables to the buildings on campus, including one that goes here into the kiln room. We plug into that. We now have access to electrons. The electrons flow through high resistance wire inside of the kiln. And by high resistance, that's a term that basically says it's difficult for the electrons to push through that wire. They're not good conductors. So you have this tremendous electron pressure, if you think of it as a pipe, and now the electrons are being pushed through this high resistance wire. There's so much friction involved that the wires heat up, they begin to become incandescent, and they give off radiant energy. And the magic of radiant energy, by the way, we started with heat under the water. Now we get the electrons to flow through the wires in the kiln, and we get the heat back. It's a fairly inefficient system, but it's the one that we have. There are three, yes?
I'm just going to make one tiny comment, and that is that you're describing AC current, And so the electrons that were generated by those magnets are not the same electrons that are ending up in your kiln. Because AC current means that all we need to do is to have the electrons move. And they
Yes, they move back and forth.
They just move back and forth. And then they bounce into the ones next to them and make those move back and forth.
Thanks
that
to
sounds
Mr.
even more
Tesla.
inefficient.
Actually, no, that's much more efficient than DC.
DC, oh really?
The DC, if this was DC current, those would be the same electrons, and my God, would they ever be tired by the time they got here.
But this was the big fight between Edison and Tesla.
Absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Conduction.
And brilliant old Edison was in the old DC mode.
That's right. He wanted everything was DC. It was
Yeah.
Tesla who really pushed the boundaries on AC.
Yes.
Tesla's my hero.
Yeah.
Thank you. I
And it's a good rock group,
been
too.
completely comfortable ignoring that.
I know. But this is one of the things I used to do in the Friday Night Science. I did one show that was all on electricity, and so I did the electron dance for the crowd.
Oh
And,
my.
I'm teaching electricity and magnetism this semester, so I have to remember to do my electron dance.
There are 3 ways that heat can move from one place to another. Conduction is something that's familiar to every one of us because I'm still remembering as a kid when it was cold and I dropped my pajama bottoms and I backed up against the stove to get a little bit warmer and I found the grill with my butt cheeks and I experienced conduction immediately.
My son did that when we had a propane heater where the fireplace was and had a glass front, and you know, kids with their little one piece PGAs, and they had the plastic feet and stuff, and so he put them against. So until we got rid of that heater, it had a mark on it of the shoe print from the conduction.
So conduction is direct contact, surface to surface, and we know that in so many ways. But the kilns, of course, you go back there and put your hand on the lid and discover if it's above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, your nervous system will just jump immediately. You don't have to think about it. Your body will just react.
You should be able to tell before you even touch it.
Well, if you go slow.
But that's the radiant heat. Before you touch it, that's the radiant heat you're feeling.
So convection is a combination of conduction and moving air, where the air molecules touch the hot surface, they become more energized than the surrounding air molecules, and then they begin to move. It's always upward.
Heat rises.
Convection heating of kitchen ovens, or we have fans in them that circulate air and getting more heat distribution. And convection is what's used in radiant floors, baseboard heaters, all sorts of sources. So in general, we use convection when we burn things. The oxidation process with the fuel, and now we have hot gases rising as a result of that.
Okay, I think you were meaning that in the floors you were meaning that had vents in the floor, not the ones with the wires that go through the actual floor. That would be
Not when I'm standing on it.
Oh. Well, yeah, but you got the floor between the. Well, okay.
Let's get really technical.
Well,
They use those a lot.
convection, you need to have airflow. You need or water flow.
Movement of gas or liquid carries heat from one place to another.
Right.
Radiation is fascinating and really trippy in my mind because radiant energy doesn't heat anything until the energy wave strikes a surface. Now, maybe a particle of dust in the air, but in our case, what we're talking about is a kiln wall. It has a coil built into the edge of the wall, and as the energy in the coil increases, the heat energy as electric current is going through there, it finally gets to the point where it's giving off energy in the form of waves. And don't heat anything until they strike the surface of your piece sitting in the kiln. And getting back to that issue of water, is when radiant energy from those coils hits the surface of your piece, it drives moisture inward until it can exit the other side of the wall. And so in some cases you end up with a lot of water vapor inside that piece, and if there's no place for the water to escape, if it's like a balloon, clay balloon, then you have that steam expansion as the piece gets above 212, and that really is an explosive combination.
That's probably why your lid on your teapot blew. Is it probably was too tight to seal.
No.
No?
The seal,
Because doesn't it expand?
the pressure from inside, if you have a teapot, is going to lift the lid or go out the spout. Yeah, it's rare to have a seal that's that specifically. I mean, just
While it's heating, the clay doesn't swell just a little bit and
yeah,
seal off?
yeah.
But
Just a
yeah,
little
it
bit.
should go out the spout.
Yeah. So, radiant energy then is heating the kiln shelves. It's heating the kiln post. It's heating the kilns. If we're sitting anywhere near it, it's heating us. And unfortunately, if somebody isn't very, very cautious with radiant energy, it's just so easy to cause pieces to explode. I used to make a series of fairly large faceted forms, and it wasn't at all unusual that I had these completed. They were about this tall, and I had finished my bisque firing, and so I take them up to Cal Poly and have them bisqued for me. And I stopped doing that because, without exception, they kept blowing them up. They're a 1/4 inch thick, but their scenario for firing didn't include a lot of drying time, and I suppose they probably blew up a lot of student work. But they'd come back with big chunks missing out of the side of these, which is disheartening at that point. So the electric kiln then provides us initially with radiant energy from the coils that heat the surface of everything in the kiln. And as they do that, those surfaces get hot, and then you've got some convection heating as the hot gases move up through the kiln. So we start by using some heat source to create the electron flow, or agitation, as it were. And we get the heat back when we plug in the kiln. So whether we're splitting atoms, or burning natural gas, or burning diesel oil, or burning wood, we basically use one form of energy to create another one that allows us to fire the kilns. The firing in an electric kiln, with some rare exceptions, is always referred to as oxidation firing.
That's the atmosphere, right?
And that refers to the fact that the atmosphere in the kiln is oxygen rich. And it's the same atmospheric oxygen that we're breathing sitting here in the room. Anyone comfortable enough with what constitutes our atmospheres to know what is the major constituent?
I'm sorry, what was that?
What is the primary constituent of the gases in our atmosphere?
Oxygen and nitrogen.
78% nitrogen. So anytime you see one of those advertisements for a company that's willing to fill your tires with nitrogen gas, you realize that they're already basically 80% nitrogen gas anyway.
Yeah, but it does work better on your race car to have nitrogen-filled tires. because they're-
no, let's get
It's a part. It's
Now-
the flammability part is part of it.
Oxygen, which we all rely on with every breath we take, is generally at sea level 21% of the atmosphere. The remaining 1% is everything else. Carbon dioxide, argon are two, the primary constituents. When we talk about the effects of industrial society and global warming, we're talking a really small change in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which apparently affects our weather and climate tremendously.
I'd like to ask, some scientists, what volcanic eruptions, how they impact the atmosphere. Oh yeah, I know they do.
All that ash, and they cut out the sunlight. Krakatoa was a real bad one.
I've just finished reading the introduction to the roadside geology of Utah, and they have a spectacular series of pages that take us from Precambrian, the earliest rocks, to the present through a whole series of steps. But in there, they talk about the mass extinctions, how many of them there were, not just the boundary at 65 million years ago, but many, many periods of damage to the climate and life on Earth. But back to our 21% oxygen. That means that when we heat the things up in the kiln, there is enough oxygen to react with the materials that we have. For instance, if you do a sculpture and you use paper as an armature to support the wet clay, and you remove most of it, but there are bits and pieces of paper still clinging to the inside of your sculpture, there'll be enough oxygen to oxidize those or burn them during the firing process. Far more significant is the ground up rocks that we use to make glaze can change with the process of firing and oxidation. So I showed you that little chunk of yellow unfired clay from the riverbed, and I showed you the red earth tone, orangish piece. So in the unfired piece, the iron is in the form of yellow iron oxide. And it goes through a chemical change during the oxidation-rich, oxygen-rich bisque firing to become red iron oxide. So the color shift there is a byproduct of the available oxygen during the firing.
That's because the molecules shift, right?
Yeah, I don't have yellow iron oxide committed to memory because there are about 5 different variations of it, and red iron oxide is the most familiar, and we'll be talking more about that here in a little bit today. So the fundamental characteristics of low-fire earthenware include the fact that the clay body, when it's mature, remains porous. In most cases, the only significant shrinkage is going from wet to dry. The decorating strategies that we use tend to include combinations of materials which are essentially paint for clay that we call underglaze. But they're not paint, they're mineral mixtures that will give us certain colors depending on how they're used. We use glaze from transparent to opaque, from white to black, from every color of the rainbow. In an oxygen-rich environment, those colors remain stable, and if the glazes are applied carefully, then those colors are highly predictable. In addition, we can apply other materials on top of a glaze. But at this point, we also lower the temperature at which we're functioning. Hello. Young man, will you introduce yourself to your classmates?
Hi, I'm Brian Ritchie, and I'm a licensed tile contractor, and I love ceramics. And I'm trying to get refreshed on glazes so I can have my own raw materials set up in my own studio to make my own glazes and fire.
Great.
So Brian signed up with an independent project, and in our consultation around that, realized that some of the material he wants desperately to own is right here, right now. I'm glad you could be here.
Should we tell him who we are?
Would be nice.
Well, that's probably thoughtful.
Yes. Hi, I'm Linda Metaxas, and I also happen to be a faculty member in the college. I'm moonlighting over here in the ceramics department. But am here because I sat in on. I was over there last semester listening to him, and I wanted to hear more.
Your name one more time?
Linda.
Linda.
I'm Mary Ellen Marcy.
And apparently that's all the introduction.
That's all you're gonna get. Yeah. I was much more forthcoming.
Yes.
I'm Vi. I've studied ceramics last semester and this semester and years ago, and I'm going from two-dimensional art to three-dimensional art.
Alright.
So that's short, sweet, and to the point.
So Brian, we were just finished, or about to finish the discussion on electric kilns, source of energy, energy transfer, and we're going to shift now to the next page. And although you can burn any combustible material, sawdust, chocolate briquettes.
Can I,
Yes.
before you go
Yeah,
on?
oh, yeah.
You
Yeah.
were just starting to say that after you, you know,
Overglazes would be the,
overglaze,
Right.
yeah, you could put, okay, so there's the possibility of adding overglazes over the glaze. But then you need to stay at even a lower temperature?
thank you.
Yeah, because you have to, it's melting differently.
Right,
Okay.
okay.
Electric kilns, oxidation.
His box of stuff.
So you are already intimately aware of many overglazed decorated materials. If you have decorated dinnerware that's not handmade, if you have ever examined the decoration, typically it's applied with overglazed decals. There are any number of those out there. You can find them in endless variations of supplements to various magazines, Sunday papers, and you can go so far as to participate in a spectacular variety of transferred imagery.
So that's glazed with
This is a porcelain white plate.
okay.
So it's
and-
just a plain white plate that is then
If you look very closely, you can see the dot matrix of a serigraph or screen printing. So all these layers were built on, so you got this very nicely made tidy decal.
But the porcelain's has got a glaze on it before.
It's just a clear glaze over white porcelain.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
what I. It's like it's shiny.
The
Yeah.
place over here that used to be behind Costco, that's all they did was put,
Well, after the
decals
Columbia
on.
Records Store Distribution Center closed, then they had the Golden State Porcelain Factory in there. The porcelain was all shipped in from China and Japan, and there they applied the decorations, the decals, and fired them and then shipped them out. And I got a chance to go into that factory just as they were closing things down. And although I finally just said I don't need to store so much stuff.
do people who hand paint porcelain, do they do that on a glazed plate or an unglazed plate?
On a glazed plate.
Okay.
That's what
So these are,
So it's on a
and it's
glaze.
very low fire that they do it.
yeah, so all this is fired. If you remember the chart from last week that showed the temperatures at which we fire things,
Yeah.
then you'll see that down there around 020 and 018. What's to say? 018 gold and white gold metallics and mother of pearl. And so China painting, when it's done by hand, such as these plates from my grandmother, are done in multiple firings, built up usually the background layer, another layer. But the China paints are quite literally overglazed enamels, very low temperature glazes. But they're handled like paint, fired on 7-8 times.
So these plates are glazed with a clear glaze first, and then the decals put on the second.
After the
second fire?
after the
Love
clear
these
glazes and the
kind of
porcelain is
things.
fired to
My
cone 10 or
great-great-grandmother
12,
was a
wherever they
Yeah.
fired it.
China
Yes.
painter.
Then the only handwork on this entire plate is this little
Now, these are decals, I presume?
authentication code.
Yeah.
So that the hand painted plates don't have that. And Misty Morning from the North American Ducks plate, I've got the certificate of authenticity, and the only thing handwritten in the certificate of authenticity is the code number, which probably matches one of these plates. Yes, that's the same one. This is an authentic plate, as it testified to by this piece of paper.
The temperature of the overglaze, the second after it's been clear glazed,
Right.
is what is how
Here,
much you said?
it's
I
cone.
probably missed those last
It's
week.
like
yeah.
018 or something, or
It's
017.
variable. Most of the China painting is done between 020 and 022.
Oh, right there. Okay.
Yeah. Now, I must tell you this because this is critical. If you ever are seduced into thinking you need to own the Star Trek series of these plates, the Hamilton Collection Misty Morning is limited to a total of 14 firing days.
Like, think how many they fire in a day.
Yeah.
So it's thousands of plates out
Oh,
there.
yeah, thousands.
Yeah, so,
So never get caught up in collecting these as an investment. If you like them, have at them. Otherwise, they're valueless.
but the hand-painted stuff that your grandmas and great-great-grandmas
Yeah.
did is valuable.
Precious
Yes.
beyond belief, yes.
I
Wasn't
have
able to
some
be here.
As long as you
wonderful stuff.
have a story to tell.
A provenance.
Thank you.
So, the decals, if you've ever gone traveling, and when I was a kid, we'd pick one up from every state and put it on the side panel of the station wagon.
Yeah.
Okay, so you just cut that out, set it in warm water, chest it. Pretty soon the printed image will begin to slide around. You slide it off, smooth it onto the surface, and then fire it. And so if you've gone to the Monterey Museum of Ocean Spectacle and bought a mug,
No, I don't do that.
yeah, this would be a blank for that sort of process. So we had a class on screen printing, so I made some decals, and so the decoration on here was done with a decal transferred onto the piece and then fired to cone 020.
You made your own decal.
Yes.
But a lot of them do them now with sublimation presses, and it's,
Yeah, but those aren't
There's no
ceramic.
counts.
Those are acrylic paintings. Yeah. As far as I know, those are,
no, you print them off on your printer, which
Right.
Epson is one of them, but you have to use a sublimation ink, and then it goes through this process on the heat press when you put it on there. I have the press and all the inks
Okay.
and stuff, so yeah.
But it doesn't give you much
That's how they
color,
make those tiles that all the artists are selling.
right.
Those are
of their-
sublimation.
Their own original art. in theory.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you have these, that came from the family, usually the porcelain came from Germany and
Limoges or whatever is what.
Bavarian.
Bavaria, yeah, one hand is Bavaria.
That's
So-
what mine is.
So this is not a technology with which I can claim any proficiency. I've done China painting, it's really interesting, but to do it as gracefully and beautifully as it can be done with usually floral motifs,
Practice.
always.
Yeah, practice.
Far more interesting for most of us is the use of metallic lusters.
Yeah.
The two most common is gold, bright gold, and white gold. You can buy them in the bookstore because the price of gold has gone up so spectacularly. The little tiny container, I think I have them in the other part of my office. Used to be you could afford, this was mother of pearl, so it's not a metallic, liquid bright platinum. That would cost thousands today. The making of it is to take the real material, and it goes through 21 to 27 steps of chemical change and reduction, and you end up with something that smells like pine sap, painted on one coat. You have to paint it on top of a surface If you paint it onto the bisque clay, it will simply be absorbed and all you get is purple. But you paint it onto the surface of the glaze after the glaze has been fired, and it changes to 24 karat gold during the firing.
See,
So
we're
it's a-
able to do that in our fused glass because the fused glass is at a much lower temperature than normal that you do clay. So it's in that range of,
Yes, yes it
you
is.
know, 022 or something.
By contrast, if you put it onto vitrified but unglazed clay, so this piece, this B-mix came out all high fired, been stained with iron oxide before it was fired, and so you end up with surfaces that look like the matte of a spray metallic paint.
That one blew out.
Yeah, I was gonna see what happened. Yeah,
So
it
it's-
does look matte. It almost changes the.
They also have it in many metals, most common being gold and copper. I don't know the difference between white gold and bright gold in terms of the chemistry. So those are overglazes. Those are materials applied on top of the glaze after the glaze has been fired, and then subsequently fired again, and sometimes multiple times. If
Is it
people
usually clear or black that they use, or what?
the
Not that one.
the metallic
Yeah.
will take on the surface characteristics of the glaze to which it's applied. So if you apply it to a gloss glaze, it will be shiny and bright. If you apply it to a matte glaze, it'll look more like the surface there on the bare clay.
If it's a dark color, does it matter?
No, it doesn't. The
So that
metallic
one's
will
done
be opaque if it's
That one
applied.
handle thing you did with the
Right.
pretty gold, what was that over?
That's just over our standard low fire clear glaze.
Okay.
The reason I never tried to put it on black glaze, I can't see where I'm painting. So if I do lots of pieces where I want those kind of accents, so I end up putting a white or a clear glaze in that area so that I can see when I paint on the metallic.
That's a smart idea, really.
Otherwise, you end up with gaps. And
Yeah. I mean, and as you get older, the eyesight's not so good anymore.
Okay, my question before we turn the page
Yes.
is, now, this is called oxidation, so you have to have oxygen in your electric kiln. So is it advisable then to always leave at least one of your peepholes open so that oxygen can get in there, not seal it up?
yes, but not for that reason.
Okay.
If you plug all of the peepholes, any of the combustion gases, there's a limited amount of combustion that takes place during the firing of the dye that's in the glaze, of the organic gums and binders that are put there so that you can paint them smoothly. And if you don't allow for some venting of that, it makes its way into the controller. So whether you have an old style controller that holds a pyrometric cone,
Like that.
or the new ones that are all computer controlled, you don't want those gases forced to go into the controller unit. So you just leave the top plug out. Don't leave the bottom plug out,
No, because all your heat.
because then you'll create a convection
A
cell, and
convection,
you'll draw in cold air blasting against the surface of the pieces.
So that's kind of like how a pressure cooker works, or the idea that none of us use pressure cookers anymore.
used to all the time.
But there's always a little vent hole at the top.
That's
Just
a
to
relief valve if necessary.
Relief valve.
Never leave the bottom people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but you're right.
Or
yeah,
if
no.
you're gonna leave the bottom hole open, and there's always going to be some form of venting at the top, whether it's through an open peephole or the seams where the lid comes down. You're going to create this flow. Well, this cold air striking the surface, you can have a perfectly fired piece, and this part of the glaze will not be melted. But you can put a block of refractory material between here and here and cause that air to move around more, and you'll get rid of most
Protect
of that
that.
problem.
Okay. I'll just leave the plug in. The bottom.
Good idea.
every time I fire the kiln, which has only been three or four times, it's an experiment.
Would there be any reason why you would want to have, you know, a bottom vent and a top vent?
Yes, especially in the preheat portion of the firing, where maybe you've got a really large sculpture and you want to create more circulation, trying to pull the moisture out of the piece. Remember, with radiant energy, electric kiln, that radiant energy is driving the moisture inward. So you want to create as much moving air in the kiln as you can to get that large piece, a cat, for instance, completely dry.
Yeah.
We solve that problem typically by using the gas kiln to bisque fire large work. And Mike's going to load a gas bisque next Monday. And then you have air circulation, and the flames moving up the thing tend to suck water out as opposed to drive it in. Thank you. These are wonderful questions and not always ones I go into, so I appreciate your contributions to the dialogue.
Yeah, and also I think a good point to recognize is that, and a lot of times with these different heat processes, we tend to think that they operate in isolation, but they oftentimes operate together or in cooperation with each other. So you just created a scenario where you have a radiant heat firing, and you're adding a convective element to it. So.
Exactly.
Good.
Yeah. Now, I said on almost all cases, people who use electric kilns fire in oxidation. Beatrice Wood, who for years lived and worked down in the Ojai Valley, was famous for doing a body of work that had a lustrous metallic sheen. And so, are you familiar with the term fatwood?
Oh yes. They sell it in they sell it in catalogs for people who live in really cold temperatures for starting fires with. Yeah.
Well, so the fatwood has got so rich in sap, so densely sappy, that you can light it like a candle. So what she would do, because she wanted to get reduction in her kiln to get the surface effect of those lustrous glazes, is then throw fatwood in at the end of the firing, and the kiln would be billowing with smoke. And she would get the glazed surfaces to create that wonderful rainbow hues of yellows and pinks and purples and such. When I was in graduate school at UCSB, I had a propensity to want to test every material I found, and I was working on a road trip out along the San Ynez River where I found these blocks of shale, rectangular pieces, really interesting things. And knowing that it was a clay-like material, I decided that I would go ahead and take a broken-off piece and bisque fire it to see what would happen. And I came back in a half an hour, and black smoke was billowing out of that kiln and up into the room above in the print shop. I turned that thing off and grabbed that. I actually had located oil shale.
He was fracking in the kiln.
Yeah, fracking. That's what we're
This is at the surface. That was a trip. But
lucky you didn't have the EPA show up.
it was underappreciated by the folks teaching upstairs.
Yeah, I'll bet.
What do you think?
There's oily black smoke all over everything. Ooh.
Okay, if you'll turn to the page now, Introduction to High Fire Ceramics, Cone Tin, Stoneware, and Porcelain. And so you have on the left side of that sheet a detail of the traditional atmospheric burner configuration. And then on the right side, composite looking into a kiln for an updraft kiln. Now there are many, many styles of kilns. We're going to keep it simple right now. So if we take that first diagram on the left, and in the floor of the kiln is a burner opening, and hovering below that burner opening is a tube, and this floats on a device which connects to a little metal piece that goes down, which connects to a pipe. And this is in our updraft kiln. This tube is in fact made of ceramic. and it sits in a holder like this. And right in the center of this little piece, this is called a nipple, is a hole, an orifice. And natural gas, under pressure, is pumped through this line and comes up and is ejected into that burner tube through the orifice. This is not a sealed opening here at the bottom. And so additional air, by what's called the Venturi effect, because the pressure of the gas is creating movement, the gas is moving upward at velocity, and the air gets into that and mixes with the gas. And if we give a source of ignition, we're going to end up with a flame, chemical oxidation reaction between natural gas and oxygen, which then yields heat energy in the kiln. The openings around the burner port, having trouble with my colored caps, also allow oxygen-rich air to be pulled in. This is called primary air, the air that's drawn into the burner. I guess ceramics people are in love with these two terms. And the air that is sucked in between the burner and the floor of the kiln is referred to as secondary air. So we make sure that we have ample flow of oxygen to fully burn the natural gas. And the chemistry of that is that methane, carbon, 4 atoms of hydrogen, methane gas or natural gas is odorless, colorless gas. When mixed with ample oxygen and a ignition source, a spark, yields the following. Carbon dioxide, water vapor, and heat. That is the basic combustion. Now, whether we're burning diesel oil, propane, butane, wood, rice, grass, hay, there are several variations in the chemical makeup of the fuel, but basically, if there's plenty of oxygen, that's the pattern that we see. And all of you have at one time or another dealt with a gas company who was reluctant to turn on your gas until they inspected your appliances. Or there was an emergency of some sort, just as we had in Napa 2 weeks ago, and my friend Tom Collins is a potter who lives in Napa, and he and his wife and son were in Seattle, and she's the CEO for Napa County, so she's on the emergency team, and their phone started going off at 3:21 in the morning, and Tom called his friend and asked him to go by the house and turn off the water and the natural gas. Guy was friendly enough to go in the house and clean up all the broken glass too before they came home. But separate from that is that a mixture of natural gas and oxygen in the right proportions is highly explosive, which is why they're so concerned. The other thing is if the burners are not well designed and have an adequate supply of oxygen, then you can get inefficient combustion, and another byproduct of that's going to be carbon monoxide. It's heavier than air, odorless, colorless, and toxic to the human respiratory system.
You might be headed that way, but so how do you know how far to open the valves that's letting in the primary air? Are you just kind of testing it, or what's the...
In kiln design, there's an awful lot of technology and engineering that's already taken place, and lots of charts that you can refer to. If you have a gas burning range, however, if you've ever been able to take one apart, there's a little triangular device that feeds into the burners. And this triangular device also has a sheet metal flap on a screw, and this thing slides back and forth. So your gas is coming in this way, and what the technician from the gas company wants to look for is that the color of this flame is blue. Because if it's orange or yellow, then it represents incomplete combustion. And not only will you get black carbon sooty deposits in the bottom of your pots, but you'll create carbon monoxide. So this flap controls the amount of air that enters that stream of fuel and oxygen to give a well-adjusted flame.
So is that just the first part of the flame we see is going to be blue?
They want the whole flame to be blue. Now,
And
that's ideal,
okay.
but you know, in reality, sometimes
We're all going to go home and look at our gas stoves and make sure the whole flame is blue.
Yeah, and if you know, hot water heaters, floor furnaces, all of those things are potential liabilities, particularly in a family with young children. So, because natural gas is odorless and colorless, the gas company also puts perfume in it, hydrogen sulfide, which smells like rotten eggs. It's really obnoxious and easily recognized. So all those people up in Napa, they had 800 calls for the smell people had around their houses.
Wow.
It's a lot of work for service crews to deal with. Go around, people don't know how to shut off their own gas. And then they don't want you to turn the gas back on until they come inspect your appliances. So anyway, so this is the basic chemistry of heating the kiln. So let's take a quick field trip. This is our well-used updraft kiln. It gets its heat from the fact that the burner ports are down here around the base of the kiln, also in the middle, and the exit flues for the kiln, all the openings up on top. And if we look underneath, below each of these burner ports, we'll see a ceramic tube hanging in that clip. And at the center bottom of that clip, you'll see the little orifice where the gas comes in. And the gas distribution line is this square tube that circulates all around.
I had to change my orifice because I had to do propane. And I don't think mine are ceramic tubes. They also
No, they're metal oftentimes. The metal oxidizes over time and eventually have to replace them. Ceramic tubes are almost bulletproof.
Oh, okay.
So there are 13 burner ports, 2 exits, and that's how this particular kiln receives its energy. If you'll step on the other side of this door before I open it. This is a downdraft kiln. So there's no opening in the ceiling.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And we have 2 on each side of the burners, which have been blown out. So let's close this door.
Yeah, I can smell.
Got unburned fuel coming into the room.
Yeah, you can smell it.
So it escapes through the same place where the flame comes in?
So behind this stack of ware is an opening at the rear of the kiln, which goes to a chimney, or it's a short chimney, but if you come around the side of the kiln, you can see it.
Yeah.
Oh, hour and a half ago.
Oh, okay. So it actually,
You're basically just pulling the moisture out of this clay
Just
for now.
finishing drying the work out, beginning the slow process. You have a lot of surface, a lot of mass to heat up. This temperature is slightly above 120 now already. We have a thermocouple. I'm sure glad we did that last week, didn't we?
Yes, we talked about the thermocouple last week.
yeah, this is.
So it's got a tube around the thermocouple, which just makes it last long. You get less fuel or combustion oxidation on the metal tip. And the temperature right now is registering 130 degrees up there in the back. Now I'm going to pull the door shut. We don't close it all the way at this point. But what I'd like you to do is move that stool and then go back and look at the flue chimney area from this side.
You gonna stay back there?
No, well, I was,
Tight squeeze?
yeah.
Okay.
So you bring that in and out.
Well, I'm not putting one of these in at home.
I don't remember.
I don't have a big enough
firing
backyard.
glaze firings with this one when I was here.
We probably weren't at that point. We're doing a lot of BIF. Now we use them both. Part of the reason was with any new kiln, there's a need to develop a sense of how well the kiln functions. Every kiln operates on the same concepts, but not necessarily with the same results.
This one, so it's a whole different deal when you're.
Right. So this, you saw the flue, the kiln shelf that slides from this side over the top of that. So we control the rate at which gases exit the kilns with these two dampers.
Which one do you like better?
I always prefer downdraft kilns. I've always built downdraft kilns. I feel like
Keep
I've
the
got
heat
more.
in. Keeps the heat in.
I feel like I have more control and a more uniform distribution of gases because they're circulating more. Here, they're just.
Everything came up, yeah.
And this kiln is quite counterintuitively, the hottest part of this kiln is this zone down here. And the coolest part is up here.
Yeah.
Do you ever go in and remove these bricks and put new ones in because
The floor?
they're so bad?
They're not affecting the kiln
They
at
don't
all.
affect it, huh?
We've had the door re-bricked 3 times.
Wow.
Okay.
This kiln was here before I was here. It had been well used in the years leading into that. So it's been remarkably durable. And the kiln furniture is made of various materials, silicon carbide and nitride bonded silicon carbide and refractory materials, like the technology of which escapes me, and all I want them to do is work. Yes, I use a Mac, not a PC.
What's the trick for diamond blading? Diamond blading, though. See how they have the lines cut into it?
They come that way.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So, that's the hardware represented in that diagram, and let's return to the diagram. The atmosphere in a fuel-burning kiln can be close to oxidizing, but whenever we're burning or combusting materials, we're using a sizable amount of the oxygen in that combustion process. So it's not going to be as rich in oxygen as is the case for an electric kiln. But most of the time, and the reason we put up with the headaches involved in using fuel-based kilns, is that we can modify the atmosphere and create weird science. Clearly qualified for some Friday night special.
Absolutely.
Where we...
Bob's reality show, huh?
Good for you.
And there the...
Bob's reality show and his glaze firing reality show. Finding stuff on the side of the road, throwing
Your
it in there.
secrets are coming out.
I have a colleague, a biologist with whom I carpooled for years. He's now retired from teaching. And he oftentimes, we would, jokingly in the car, go, you know, they think I love to impart knowledge on biology, when in reality I just like to go in the back room and play with the snakes.
Was that Nick? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, everybody's got their
So
own thing.
being a potter has kept me out of prison. From early childhood, I have a love affair with fire.
The pyromaniac.
So the peculiar thing about a fuel burning kiln is that we can create a chemical reaction in the kiln that causes the oxides of metal to shift toward their more pure state. It's called reduction.
Oh.
No, I got my pens out here.
So when we're in the early part of the firing,
Pens out here, and I don't know where they went.
we want the flame around these burner ports to be giving us as much heat as possible for the least amount of fuel. And that process works to create this standardized combustion. Ample supply of oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and heat. If we do something to change the ratio of fuel and oxygen, we can alter that recipe for combustion, and by sliding this damper partway across the opening, that's going to restrict the available space for hot gases to exit the kiln. And if you remember that diagram, we had air entering the burner in two places. Some of that air entering into the base of the burner tube.
That was the primary and then the
Primary and secondary air.
source. All right.
And the more we restrict the ability for these gases to exit the kiln, the less of this oxygen-rich air is allowed to enter the kiln. This is where it's Friday Night Science.
All right, that's my reason.
So as we begin to restrict the supply of oxygen, we can do that one of two ways. We can increase the quantity of fuel, or we can restrict the amount of oxygen entering the kiln. In most cases, we have the fuel set at a standard level of gas pressure, and by closing the damper, pretty soon less oxygen is available. These flames begin to increase in length
Because it's looking for more
in search of
fuel.
oxygen to go with the fuel
Okay.
to finish the combustion cycle. And before very long, we begin to see flames exiting out of the damper. And that's an indication that there's not enough oxygen in here to completely combust the fuel that's being injected under pressure. And here's what's happened to the combustion chemistry. I've actually included this on the next page.
Oh, okay.
Let's see, I think you're not getting this page?
Or this one.
Okay. looks to me like
You omitted.
I owe you a page. So, how about
What's that right there?
that's the same handout set that I gave you. I missed a page. Shame on me. Which means I'll go get that right now. So we'll take a 5-minute break. Do whatever you need. So with restricted oxygen availability,
Quick for me. Go ahead.
we then have the following byproducts of inefficient combustion.
There's a lot in it.
It's on that side.
I'll do this later, huh?
There.
Sorry. You handed it to me, but it took me that long to get it done. Okay. There you go.
That's okay, we won't forget you.
So, less oxygen. We control the flow of oxygen into the kiln by the damper. The more we close that, the less secondary and eventually primary air that can be injected into the kiln. And now we get, as before, carbon dioxide. We get carbon monoxide. We get elemental carbon. That's the black soot that you see around the edges of the kiln ports and door. Water vapor and heat.
Okay. This one.
This one. Okay, right there.
CO is what?
Carbon monoxide.
Carbon monoxide. This is the CO2 is dioxide. Okay.
Correct.
I should have
You
known
got
that.
only one.
I should have been able to
Oh.
figure that out. Monoxide, one oxygen. Okay. Yeah.
Hot carbon and carbon monoxide are not at all in comfortable states of existence. They desperately want to become anthropomorphized
They want
molecules.
what?
They desperately want to become CO2.
Okay.
And so they will go in search of available oxygen in the kiln
Okay.
from any source. One of the most commonly used materials
Okay.
in clay bodies and in glazes is red iron oxide. And one of the peculiarities is this is 2 atoms of iron, ferrous,
Right.
Fe,
3 of oxygen.
3 atoms of oxygen. It's extremely familiar. Anytime you see red soil, it's caused by the red iron oxide. Anytime you see the saw that you left out overnight on a foggy night is rusty the next day, that's red iron oxide. Anytime you see Native American paintings that are red, the red iron oxide from the source of hematite that is indigenously available, ground up and mixed with whatever suspension. There's on the outer electron shell of this molecule, there's a gap that allows the red iron oxide to affix itself to cotton clothing or rock surfaces. Extremely reluctant to let go once it's there. So the Native Americans may have painted with red, black, and white, but the black was carbon and the white was diatomaceous earth or clay, and those have washed away long ago, and the red will still, the paintings will still be on the cliff face. But in glazes, this is extremely common colorant.
Yeah.
And over here, we've got 2 pieces of the carbon chain that are desperate for more oxygen. And they want that oxygen more than the iron does. And the result of the process is that a molecule of ferrous oxide will lose an atom of oxygen and become 2 molecules of black iron oxide.
Okay.
This is great alchemy. This is,
Okay.
yes,
So is the Fe0, should that have a 2 in front of it?
yeah.
Okay.
So if you want to have balanced equations,
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of like,
yeah.
Okay.
We still had 2 atoms of iron, we still
yeah,
have 2 atoms
now
of
I
iron.
got it.
Now, black iron oxide has some very interesting characteristics. The color changes one. Another is it is a powerful melting agent, a powerful flux. And so our glazes are designed when we plan to do a reduction firing. This is the reduction chemical reaction. If we were at 2 and 3 as this ratio, now we're 1 to 1. We've actually moved the iron closer to the pure metal. That's chemically speaking, that's a reduction reaction. Therefore, the name of this kind of firing is a reduction firing. And as a melting agent, our glazes are designed so that that takes into account that additional melting effort that will be generated as we shift over to black iron oxide. Let you ponder that for a moment.
I haven't taken chemistry since high school.
Okay, I get all of that, but what impact does the black iron oxide have in the glaze at the end? Here, he's going to show us.
Yeah.
Is this mine?
I've never had
Yeah.
a prep room, so this is my hole in the wall.
I gave you one last semester, but I think you don't have it anymore.
I don't know where it's at.
That's right.
Well, you have an attic in your office.
I made one, yeah.
Want me to move?
So it's not in front of the camera again.
This process, this chemical change, must take place before the clay body vitrifies. If the clay body vitrifies, it becomes glass-like, and these gases cannot penetrate into the clay. So, I trust you'll remember these 2 pieces of bisque-fired Amador. Same clay body. One bisque-fired to cone 04, one bisque-fired to cone 06. So, Brian, what I'd like you to do is lick each one of those.
Oh, yeah, we did that.
We did that.
Which part did nobody? Oh yeah. Okay.
What did you notice?
Well, I noticed that it absorbs in.
The same amount in each?
Almost. Maybe not. Is this the one that's more vitrified?
It was bisque-fired to a higher temperature, that's correct.
So this one absorbs faster than this one.
Right.
Because it's more porous. Porosity. Porosity killed it.
So we talked about why it's so important to bisque-fire our brown clay at an appropriate temperature so it doesn't begin to vitrify. When it begins to vitrify, it loses porosity. When we go to glaze, we take both of these, dip them into the glaze for 1 second. Which one's going to have a thicker layer of glaze?
Right. Lower one, yeah.
The one with more porosity. Well, simultaneously in our firing process, we need to be able to get these gases, particularly the carbon monoxide, to penetrate into the porous clay body. And when it does so, what will happen is that the iron in the clay body will be changed from red iron oxide to black iron oxide. Now, it's not all iron. There's other materials in there, so it's dark gray. But the Amador, the color here, is from the iron after it's bisque fired. That iron is changed to black iron oxide when we've restricted the amount of available oxygen. We begin to have the flame jetting out the top of the kiln, and the carbon monoxide is going in search of completion. Make me whole. I want to be CO2. And it does that at the expense of the red iron oxide, and so now we begin to see that.
Okay.
So then when we see red clay stuff, bowls and stuff like that, that's earthenware, low fire then.
Yes, if I understand what you're describing.
In your high fire, you don't have one that fires still red?
Well, if it,
No, we don't.
Okay,
In a reduction firing.
in a reduction firing, which
That's
is
what-
in
that's what this
gas
is.
kiln.
But if it's in an
Okay.
oxidation,
you-
it'll maintain its red.
if you don't,
Yes.
if you don't restrict, if you don't close this and you don't restrict the oxygen flow, then there should be enough oxygen, and so shouldn't the clay body remain red iron oxide?
Well, at higher temperatures, it depends on a lot of variables.
other things,
But
yeah.
the primary one being that it ends up more yellow than it does.
So
And it does red, yeah, okay.
part of what you're saying right now is in the reduction, the clay body's going to turn black because you're going to see
The iron oxide is going to turn from
Turn
red
black.
iron oxide to black iron oxide. And that's going to darken.